Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Shekar Krishnan. I'm a candidate running for City Council to represent Elmhurst and Jackson Heights. I want to thank you all so much for making time for our conversation tonight, our first conversation in our Shake It Up with Shekar series, starting with housing justice in our city and in New York State. First, I also want to thank everyone here for the incredible amount of grassroots and community support since our campaign launched 2 weeks ago. We've seen a tremendous amount of energy and enthusiasm from people in our communities, from around the city, and we're so grateful because truly this is a people-powered campaign centered around advocating and fighting on the issues that matter most to our communities and issues of systemic injustice in our city right now. I'm running for City Council because right now in New York City, our communities of Elmhurst and Jackson Heights are in crisis. We're the epicenter of the COVID-19 outbreak. It was our immigrant tenants who were standing on long lines outside of Elmhurst Hospital at the height of the pandemic without health insurance, who couldn't socially isolate, living in overcrowded housing that's so unaffordable, and who are our excluded workers who weren't receiving any kind of assistance from government at any level. As a lawyer for low-income tenants in our city, fighting to defend their housing rights, fighting for housing as a human right, and fighting to hold government accountable against slumlords and the city when it tries to rezone neighborhoods, especially poor communities of color, I have fought a lot of these systemic fights in our communities and around New York City. Right now, what we need is to dismantle these systems of oppression and really build a New York that works for everyone. All of these issues, from housing to education, to policing in our criminal system, to climate justice, to family justice, these are all urgent issues in New York right now, especially during this pandemic, that demand structural solutions that really change in a systemic way the deep inequalities in our city, especially for our most vulnerable neighborhoods like Elmhurst and Jackson Heights. I want to start out by first saying to everyone, thank you so much for coming. Thank you, State Senator Julia Salazar, for joining us tonight. We're so grateful and so appreciative to have you. I thought we could begin by first telling everyone, and I see it's already happening, but just for the sake of the quality of the video feed and the audio as well, if everyone could please shut off your video for this part of the discussion, and also will mute yourselves as well. And once our conversation is concluded, we open it up for question and answer. We'd love to hear your questions. Turn your videos back on at that point. Raise your hand, comment in the chat. But we thought we would structure this by having a conversation about some of the pressing issues first when it comes to housing justice, and then opening it up to everyone for questions. I first want to start by just highlighting my housing justice platform, which you can find by going to www.voteshekar.com. That's www.voteshekar.com. And housing justice is one of our main platforms that's there. When it comes to housing inequality and injustice in our city, one of the most fundamental problems is that housing is a human right, and New York City and New York State do not treat it that way. There are things readily available that our city government can do to change that truth and make sure that we're actually recognizing housing for the human right that it is. One, government, it is the role of government to be providing safe, dignified, and truly affordable housing for all New Yorkers. This means a New York Homes Guarantee. This means investing massively and repairing our public housing, which is falling apart under our watch while developers rezone immigrant neighborhoods in ways that they shouldn't be doing. It means permanently rehousing homeless New Yorkers. We have a huge crisis of homelessness right now. And instead, our city is looking to a broken shelter system instead of actually finding ways to permanently rehouse our homeless populations. It means ending the way in which landlords illegally warehouse apartments. There are so many vacant apartments in rent-regulated buildings and throughout New York City. It's the responsibility of city government to make sure that those apartments are not illegally vacant and held off the market, but are actually rented out to all of those who need housing so desperately. And of course, during COVID, the crisis right now, we need to make sure that rent and mortgage relief is provided, that rent is canceled for tenants who can't pay rent, and mortgages are canceled for small homeowners who can't pay their mortgages. The crisis is just spiraling further and further out of control since March with no such relief in sight. Secondly, the rezoning processes in our city fundamentally favor private developers and city interests over the voices of communities. This means that we need to make sure rezonings are actually affirmatively further fair housing under the Federal Fair Housing Act instead of perpetuating segregation in our neighborhoods. It means we have to be protecting and establishing tenant anti-harassment task forces, like in Elmhurst, where we're seeing so much displacement and luxury development. We need a task force to actually protect tenants in Elmhurst who are struggling so much, to protect historic properties like the African American burial ground and the Yanta House that are being destroyed and demolished because of this kind of luxury development in Elmhurst. And we need to place a moratorium on luxury rezonings citywide right now, because they are segregating and destroying so many communities, especially low-income communities of color. This also means that our land use process, otherwise known as ULURP, needs to be undone, and an entirely new comprehensive community planning process that actually takes into account the voices of community folks needs to be designed in this city if we are ever to think about housing and planning in a comprehensive way that truly defends neighborhoods instead of destroying them. Finally, as a city government, we have to make sure that we are sustaining and expanding the resources, services, and programs that exist for tenants. It means legalizing basement apartments, where so many immigrant tenants, especially in our neighborhoods of Jackson Heights and Elmhurst, live right now with no protections, by supporting and enacting the citywide BASE campaign that so many frontline groups have led. It also means that we need to be expanding our Right to Counsel program, not just for legal services, but also for tenant organizers that are doing such critical work in our neighborhoods too. And we have to be making sure that tenant anti-harassment laws, that things like violations on buildings are actually enforced by city government. The laws mean so little on paper when they are not enforced by government agencies, and that's exactly what's happening right now. These are the issues that we'll be talking about tonight in different ways. And I'm so excited to be able to discuss this with you and with State Senator Julia Salazar, who has been such a champion on these issues, both in New York State and in New York City. State Senator Salazar and I have worked together for a long time on all different issues of housing justice in some of the most gentrified and vulnerable neighborhoods in the city, as well as on state issues as well. She is a champion for tenants' rights, someone who has fought unafraid and unabashedly to make sure that tenants are actually placed first in New York State and that housing justice is front and center when it comes to both New York State politics and also New York City as well. So with that, I'd like to introduce State Senator Julia Salazar. Thank you so much for joining us. And we'd love to hear from you a bit about how you see the fight for housing in our city right now.
Absolutely. Wow. Thank you so much, Shekar. I'm really honored and thrilled to be here with you all. I have learned so much from Shekar over the past few years and in my time as a legislator, and especially in my ongoing fight for housing justice in our city and state. It really is an honor to be here with you. And thank you to your team for putting this together. My name is Julia Salazar, and I represent New York's 18th district. We call it the Great 18th District here in Brooklyn. I live in Cypress Hills, East New York, but represent the neighborhoods of East New York, part of Brownsville and Bed-Stuy, Bushwick, Williamsburg, and Greenpoint. And so you could say North Brooklyn, we have really been at the forefront of the affordability crisis for a long time. We've experienced a lot of what Shekar eloquently spoke to, the consequences of harmful rezonings at the city level, particularly when Bloomberg was mayor, have had devastating impacts that we continue to see the impact of every day in terms of gentrification that drives out long-term Black and brown residents of our district, and making it unaffordable for families to continue to live here. That was the problem before this pandemic struck. So, really that has been exacerbated as a result of the public health crisis and the economic crisis that we're facing. In Brooklyn alone, Shaker spoke about in Queens and in his council district how you've been the epicenter of the epicenter, and similarly in Brooklyn alone, more than 5,000 people now have passed away from COVID-19, and that is just a devastating and shocking number. In the meantime, while many of our neighbors have lost family members and loved ones to the pandemic, they've also lost their jobs, their income, are unable to return to work, and businesses are also struggling to continue to pay commercial rents, to pay their costs and stay afloat. The economy is making it impossible for millions of people to continue to live here and survive. And meanwhile, New Yorkers have received almost no financial relief at all to help alleviate this housing crisis that is only becoming worse. The eviction moratoriums have been half measures and inadequate. And it's a temporary Band-Aid at best. This summer, the state legislature passed a bill to provide vouchers to landlords on behalf of rent-burdened tenants who lost income during the pandemic, but it was a really lousy bill, to be frank. The criteria to qualify for those vouchers, which is the only relief offered to tenants, the landlord's tenants have to earn less than 80% of AMI. And we can talk more about area median income, but AMI is not it's not something that is determined equitably, right? And it's really harmful to lower income communities in New York, especially. And additionally, in order to qualify for this relief, they would have had to been paying more than 30% of their household income in rent, which is definition of rent burden, basically, before March 7th. So before the pandemic, the state of emergency was officially declared. Needless to say, at best, this relief would help maybe 50,000 tenants in our entire city. To put that in perspective, there are 5.4 million renters in New York City alone. And about a quarter of them have not really been able to pay rent for the past several months, for the duration of the state of emergency, right? Because if you're not working or if you've lost income, it's pretty difficult to be able to pay your rent. So on the other hand, as a state legislator, I've been working with local housing advocates and experts, including Shekar and Communities Resist, and other organizations coming together to introduce a bill that offers a truly closed loop, comprehensive response to this crisis. We call it the Relief for All bill, or the long name, the Emergency Coronavirus Affordable Housing Preservation Act. I'm the bill's lead sponsor in the state Senate. Assemblymember Yulene New is the bill's lead sponsor and champion in the Assembly. If we were to pass this legislation or similar legislation to forgive rent payments, we would be able to provide relief for tenants, for property owners, nonprofit affordable housing providers, small businesses, et cetera, who have all been impacted by this crisis, even if in different ways. Housing really affects every single one of us. And so that's exactly what we need. We need a solution that is going to stop the domino effect. And this is something that we can all really get behind. So anyway, I'm excited. I'm most excited about this legislation. Some call it canceling rent. Certainly, that's what we're advocating for. But what we're really advocating for is comprehensive relief. I live in a neighborhood. I am a tenant, but I'm a tenant in a small home. It's an owner-occupied home, and a lot of there are in my part of my district, there are more homeowners than in the rest of the district, and it's almost entirely Black and brown homeowners. A lot of people who are struggling, and a lot of foreclosures, a lot of people on the tax lien sale. So anyway, we understand here in our district, just as you understand in Queens, that this problem needs a comprehensive solution, and that's why I'm also really excited about Shekar's platform, because it doesn't leave any stone unturned. You know that that we need to address this at every single point, and in the many ways that the affordability crisis is impacting New Yorkers.
Thanks so much, Senator Salazar, for those excellent words too, just about the fight that we're going through right now and the fight that we have ahead of us as well. And I think there were some points that you made I just wanted to take apart and analyze as well. One thing that you said, which was absolutely so true, is that this is a crisis that obviously predates COVID itself. In our neighborhoods, gentrification, displacement are skyrocketing in Black and brown communities throughout this city. We've had a real estate industry that's really dominated city and state politics for so long. And then now, and tenants being forced out of their homes by tactics that you and I have seen, literally landlords taking sledgehammers to their buildings and destroying and vacating buildings overnight, shutting off all the services, things that are, wildly illegal, but they're able to get away with them because of the lack of enforcement. So let's go back to that in a second, but in thinking about now in the middle of this pandemic, one point that you made too was just how all of these eviction moratorium by court order, by the governor, have all been half measures, completely inadequate. Meanwhile, tenants and small homeowners who can't pay their mortgage are falling deeper and deeper into debt with no end in sight. The courts are reopening, the housing courts. There's a real fear of a whole cascade of thousands of eviction cases. And then we have a bill that you and Assembly Member Ewing New have really pushed that provides a comprehensive platform on all of these issues, from rent forgiveness to to mortgage relief, to nonprofit affordable housing developers, HDFCs, small co-ops. So if you can talk a little bit about those different parts of the bill, and then also, from a political standpoint, or some real talk, what's going on right now in Albany? Session's about to start again. What are our chances of getting this bill passed, and what are the holdups right now?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start by talking a little bit about what's happening in Albany right now, since I know that people are eager to know. The state Senate, will be convening on a conference retreat. We'll be conferencing. The Senate Democrats will be conferencing early next week. And I am told that we will be rigorously discussing potential solutions, such as the Relief for All bill, and others, to try to provide this relief. What we know is part of the failure earlier this year to provide comprehensive relief was because we were relying on really a state budget deficit in order to try to provide relief. And we were promised that, if we just wait a little longer, more relief will come from the federal government. Some relief came in the CARES Act, but it was totally inadequate, right? And that was the bill that I spoke about before, that that was passed this summer, relied on just $100 million in CARES Act funding. And then additionally, because the criteria to qualify for that relief was so strict, even now, several months later, HCR has not been able to provide relief for more than like a few thousand tenants. That's like a block. That's like how many people live on my block, right? And that's wild. And so really, we have this opportunity. We don't have to wait until the new session, and we shouldn't, because it's already been far too long. We have an opportunity to finally provide comprehensive relief. We need to pass this legislation, and we need the governor to support it, right? And what that means from everyone listening is to tell your representatives in Albany, because it's really on us right now, and we'll talk more about how the city and state can work together, and the city, especially the city council's role in all of this. But what we really need right now is for the state to act. And if we pass legislation like this, it'll actually provide, again, relief for tenants, for small businesses. The bill that I mentioned, the bill number is S8190, the Relief for All bill. What's unique about it is that it doesn't only offer relief for residential tenants, but also for commercial tenants. We really, we're very thoughtful in drafting this legislation, and what we want to make sure is that everyone who needs relief can get it and not have to go through barriers and jump through hoop after hoop, because what we've seen in the past several months since this summer is that when you make it difficult for people to qualify for relief, they're just not going to get that relief, right? And right now the impact is too devastating for us to take that chance or to legislate that way. And so in the case of this bill, it would be assumed, if someone says that they have lost income due to COVID-19, that they are eligible, and tenants will be able to seek this relief, and it will be provided to property owners who can, demonstrate that they have lost rental income, or rather they've lost, income that would otherwise be rental income if they're rental property owners, so that as a consequence of tenants, not paying rent at all, their rent being forgiven, the property owners who need relief would be eligible for it. And this shouldn't be unique, but unfortunately, what we've seen so often in public policy is the people at the very top are bailed out, and it's just sort of expected to trickle down. But that isn't realistic. And the rest of us, the majority of us know that isn't what happens when you bail out the banks or the corporate landlords who don't deserve help and don't need financial assistance, right? Exactly. So we want to do the opposite with this legislation.
I think there are two things about the legislation that I know what makes it so powerful is one, like you said before, how comprehensive it is. Commercial tenants, homeowners, and mortgage relief in addition to residential tenants as well. And two, the second piece, which I know has been a critical piece for all of us in the housing justice coalitions, housing justice for all, right to counsel coalitions, is that oftentimes, like you said, so much of the aid that the state and city provide is means tested, and it also requires immense amounts of proof. And if you're an undocumented tenant, working off the books, let's say, you're not going to be able to prove that. And to put the burden on tenants, for example, whether you're residential or commercial, whatever it may be, to have to show all these forms of proof and evidence like it's a court of law, automatically is a bar excluding those who actually need the relief the most. So what I really think was excellent about this bill too is that it doesn't require that kind of proof that automatically excludes people who need that most. So that's a great point. And shifting gears a little bit, you mentioned this too. So on the state side, we know what the fight is coming up in Albany right now in the session ahead. Now let's shift gears a little bit to the city side. So oftentimes you hear, well, there's a lot of state focus on housing, and that's true. There are many state laws there, but there are also so many city laws too that actually come into play when it comes to tenants' rights and housing. And so my first question to you is, what do you see the city council being able to do to collaborate with you and state senators and state elected officials and state government in enforcing our housing laws? What can the role of the city council be, and how can it be improved?
Yeah, absolutely. So you used the key word enforcing, right? One of the main ingredients here that I think is often overlooked is the importance of implementation and enforcement, because we can pass the strongest, in 2019, for example, at the state level, right, we passed the strongest tenant protections that we've seen, certainly in any of our lifetimes, in a very long time in New York State. And they're absolutely critical, but without implementation and without without enforcement, the law is honestly useless, right? And I remember when I was first running for office in 2018, I sat down with someone we both know, actually with Marty Needleman, to seek his advice, and I wanted him to help inform my housing platform, as somebody who's been defending tenants for many years in New York. And what he told me was enforcement is the number one thing, right? We need our city agencies to actually be enforcing the law, right? So that's really critical. Additionally, it's even harder, even if the law is being enforced when tenants go to housing court, for example. Not all tenants have right to counsel, right? When it comes to housing court, it needs to be expanded and fully funded here in New York City, to make sure that everyone, regardless of their access to resources or their immigration status or anything else, has representation, truly has representation in housing court. And there's a lot more that I could say about this. One thing that I think about a lot in terms of what the city could be doing is public housing. So like in my district, for example, and I know that there's a lot of people with tremendous need and tenants, of course, in Queens, and a lot of people who are rent burdened. There's like maybe fewer public housing units, right? In my district, I represent more than 25 NYCHA developments. It's quite a lot. And of course, there are hundreds of thousands of public housing tenants in the city and more outside of New York City, but it's mostly here. And so it's up to both the state and the city, I think, to fully fund NYCHA, given that the federal government, of course, has failed to for a long time, and improve the conditions for people living in public housing, because they're, in general, pretty poor conditions. And the solution is not to privatize our public housing, but rather for us to robustly invest in repairing and restoring our public housing, which was once desirable housing for people of different income levels to live in. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think that, it's in some ways the problems at the city level are so basic, right? Like enforcement is everything. The laws aren't worth the paper they're written on if you're not enforcing them. And how many buildings we know in your district too, with 300, 400 violations where they're accruing, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars in fines, and city government never actually collects on those fines at all. It's horrendous to see that. And it's also, to your point too, about public housing, the way in which the city efforts now to privatize public housing, which is absolutely unacceptable and just really a shirking of responsibility for housing, as you said before white flight, going back to urban planning practices, decades earlier, was actually good housing until because of redlining and disinvestment in communities, it changed completely when Black and brown residents were forced into it, and then they divested from public housing. But I think you're right that the lack of attention to public housing, while like you look at Queensbridge houses, which has one of the largest lead paint scandals and problems in the country, but there's also all of these rezonings like the Flushing rezoning, Industry City, so many of these things happening that the city is focused on and privileging developers on, while our public housing stock is falling apart. And it's true too with our homeless communities as well. As we said before, how much our homelessness crisis is skyrocketing, and how much vacant housing is being illegally warehoused that could easily be used to permanently rehouse our homeless in a way that's affordable and provides them with safe and dignified housing too. So to your point, there's just so many things on the city level that can be done where, that work in tandem, if not augment, or if not entirely expand what the state is doing as well. So on that note, I'd also, I want to open it up. I know there are a lot of questions we have too, a lot of interesting topics of discussion. I do want to encourage people once again, before we start our questions, a lot of the issues that Senator Salazar and I are talking about are things that we've worked together on for a very long time. And also, if you go check out our housing platform on the website, www.voteshaker.com, vote, SHEKAR.com, you can see under our housing justice section all of these different issues that we're talking about, from community land trusts, for example, and low-income co-ops, to the Right to Counsel program and the BASE campaign. So please go check it out when you can. Now we'll open it up for some questions, and I would encourage anyone who wants to ask a question to either turn on your video, raise your hand. You're more than welcome to do so at this point. Put it in the chat as well. If you're watching on Facebook, submit it on Facebook too. And we'll try to get through as many questions as possible. In an effort to do so, we just ask everyone to keep your questions to about 30 seconds or so, so we can have some good discussion about it and get in as many questions as possible. So our first question goes to Bill Bruno. Hey, Bill, good to see you.
Shaker.
How you doing?
Good, how are you?
Good, good. Thanks so much for joining. You're up. Go ahead.
Thanks for doing. I've heard a lot of talk about canceling rent payments. It's a good, straightforward policy. However, I've also read that may be subject to constitutional challenges, either as a taking of property or there's a constitutional clause that limits the extent to which states can impair contracts. Now, you get some leeway about that in emergencies, but I don't know if the case law has ever covered something where you're dealing with an absolute cancellation of rent payments, saying these will no longer count. Have you looked into the possible constitutional challenges, to these measures?
Okay, do you want to go first, or you can go first?
I was gonna suggest that you go first, but yeah.
Sure, I'm happy to. Sure.
Cool.
Good question, and I think that this has come up a lot since we as a housing movement have been mobilizing around this legislation bill. And I would say two things. One is this is a tactic. The state, not to get too legal about it, but the state has broad authority, as you mentioned too, especially in an emergency setting, to implement measures within its, from a constitutional standpoint, its police powers to really address fundamental issues of health, public welfare, and housing, for example, all of these large crises. I firmly believe that state government and this legislation falls within the ambit of those protections, and would not raise any constitutional challenges. What I do know is, and I say this as someone who's represents a lot of coalitions in fights against the city of New York over rezonings and otherwise, and landlords, is that the opposition, the real estate lobby, developer lobby, likes to throw these things out there to kind of deflect attention and throw all of us off our game from advocating for these things. What I say in the legal context, and I think it's absolutely true in the political context, is you put your best foot forward. Let them make the arguments they want to make. Let them challenge it. I think Julia will tell you too, when the rent laws were passed last year, there was plenty of litigation by revenue and otherwise to challenge the rent laws. It all didn't work. And this is really, we as a movement can't be afraid to put forward bold solutions in the concern of out of litigation that will come anyway and that will fall apart anyway. So Julia, I don't know if you're going to add something to that too.
Yeah, no, there isn't much I think to add. We are always being threatened when we try to pass bold policy with lawsuits from well-funded opposition, and that was of course the case when we passed the HSTPA last year, the new rent laws, and it failed, right? The attempts from REBNY and the RSA to try to disregard the new laws that would finally give tenants more power and representation under the law. Their efforts to dismiss that have failed. And it was largely on the same basis that they would probably try to dispute legislation like Relief for All as well. But additionally, I do think it's important to emphasize that this legislation seeks to actually provide relief for property owners as well, for those who actually need financial relief. Yeah.
Great point. Great question, Bill. Thank you. So our next question, this is a good one too, from Colby on Facebook, is Can you both tell us a bit more about the root causes of gentrification? How much of it is an individual problem, think gentrifiers, versus policy and the real estate industry? So what are the root causes of gentrification? How much of it is individual based versus larger development real estate forces at work? I'm sure you and I both have a lot to say on this. You go first, please, and I can add in after.
Absolutely. So I think that, like other problems in our society that are having such an enormous harmful impact, this is really a systematic problem. Gentrification. It is about those who have the most being favored under the law, and having the ability to buy properties, to warehouse units, right? To deregulate apartments, something that we tried to fix in a problem that we tried to fix in the 2019 rent laws, but that was only after years of policies such as vacancy decontrol, for example, leading to the loss of hundreds of thousands of units of rent stabilized housing. When that happens, what does that have to do with gentrification, right? When we lose truly affordable housing, we of course make it impossible for people who previously could afford to live in the community, especially, primarily Black and brown families, from continuing to be able to live in that community, and then they are replaced by people who can afford to live in that community. I personally I've never met someone or even heard of someone who moves somewhere, let's say to Williamsburg from somewhere else because they want to displace a Black or brown family, right? So I think it is convenient for the systemic actors, will say, that the people who move into a community are the face of gentrification for some people. It's convenient for the people who actually have deliberately and systemically perpetuated gentrification. It is convenient for them when individuals, when we make it about individual responsibility. And we also know that in New York, the real estate industry has had an outsized impact on politics for many years, really, for again our entire lives, and the impact of that is public policy that has favored the very wealthy and corporate property owners at the expense of tenants and people who previously were able to afford to live in neighborhoods where they grew up, and they can no longer afford to live there. And that's really the harmful impact of gentrification.
That's a great point. And I think, this is a great question. I think, you and I have faced a lot in our work. I mean, your district has some of the most gentrified neighborhoods in New York City. And my organization, has been doing anti-gentrification, anti-displacement work in them for a long time: Williamsburg, Bushwick, Greenpoint. And I think it's, you're absolutely right. There's the real estate and developers and landlords provide the framework in neighborhoods to facilitate gentrification, whether it's demolishing buildings for luxury projects, before even doing that, vacating those buildings through sledgehammers, illegal tactics, shutting off all services, taking an empty building, pretending that was legal to do that, demolishing it and building a new one, right? And then the laws on the systemic level allow for those things to happen, either because the laws aren't enforced, which is the biggest issue, or the landlords and developers manipulate those laws. The only thing I would add to it too is I do think that individuals as well, it's incumbent on individuals to be conscious when moving into neighborhoods, especially Black and brown immigrant neighborhoods, to be conscious of those systemic things, because there is individual responsibility there too. Are you moving, asking yourself the question, are you moving into an apartment that's a rent regulated apartment where the rent has been jacked up from the tenant before? Did you moving in come at the cost of a family that was displaced, a family of color that was displaced, to make way for you to come in? Are you participating in the rent strikes and tenant association meetings in your building to fight for the rights of all, even if services are better in your apartment, are they better for your Black and brown neighbors who are receiving far less? And I just say that because, the work that we do, a lot in these tenant associations, we can see things like that sometimes where, in our building meetings, in the lobby, in the stairwell, it's oftentimes the families who have been there for a very long time who are meeting with us, and the newer tenants who come to a meeting or don't participate. And there's clearly different sets of services that landlords provide for example, English-speaking tenants versus Spanish-speaking tenants. So, in that sense, and that's obviously illegal under the Fair Housing Act. So to me, I always say, I think individuals should be really conscious of how they exacerbate these larger forces of developers in real estate, because the two together can work to really exacerbate gentrification. But I think, it's convenient to kind of, point to one over the other and really obscure the complexity of the problem and how deep it goes. But that was a great, I think, discussion to have too. Another question we have is Mark from Elmhurst would like to know, what can we do about bad landlords and developers? Maybe some examples of fights that we've had and that we've won. I think you want to, I guess I can add in a couple from here, and then we can, you can mention them too. But I think, there's a lot of these fights that we're facing, and really what we see, and I think, Julia, you know this so well too, is when you fight, you win. It's when you give up and you stop fighting that the developers and landlords actually take over. So whether it's, a whole coalition of community residents mobilized to fight against the Target rezoning that was coming to Elmhurst and really fought it hard and successfully too. Of course, the biggest win that stands out to many of us too is the Amazon rezoning and development that would have come here to Long Island City, but no doubt would have had impacts all along the 7 train. And how many frontline groups really led that fight from both a housing and a racial justice standpoint, and defeated and turned back the march of Amazon to LIC, down to fights that I think we've had in our neighborhoods too, whether it was, my first case out of law school was the Broadway Triangle rezoning, where we sued the city over a rezoning that would have excluded Black and brown residents from the housing in Williamsburg and Bedford-Stuyvesant. And we stopped that and redid the entire rezoning, which was one of the only ones of Bloomberg's rezonings that was stopped. But also other fights to take buildings away from landlords that engage in these practices. Maybe you want to talk about that in your district, Julia? I know we've had plenty of fights against landlords that we've won to take buildings away from them.
Yeah, absolutely. And Shekar, you personally have been involved in a lot of those fights in my district. I was thinking of it more from a state policy perspective, because even though enforcement and implementation is critical, and the role that people play as tenants in solidarity with other tenants, as people in solidarity with your neighbors, that's absolutely critical as well. But I'm thinking about legislation that we have at the state level that if it were passed would expand protections for tenants from eviction, and also policies that will disincentivize some of the predatory real estate practices, since you talk about, not only bad landlords, but also predatory developers, right? One is the good cause eviction bill that we have at the state level. So the laws that were passed last year, while very important, primarily, not exclusively, but primarily help tenants who live in the rent regulated system already. But what we have not yet done and we need to do is pass something called good cause eviction, which would extend protections to the many tenant households, the majority of tenant households who have very little protection under the law from a de facto eviction, we'll call it, right? Somebody who at the end of their lease, their landlord is able to raise the rent exponentially or as high as they want. And there is nothing under the law that prevents them from doing that. And also it's, related to tenant harassment, another mechanism that property owners often use in order to force tenants out as well. And additionally, there is legislation called the Small Home Anti-Speculation Act, which my neighbors and constituents here in East New York have been especially inactive in advocating for. which would try to address the problem of home flipping. So in our community and in communities across the city, especially in Queens actually as well, there are developers who are looking at the current housing market and the economic crisis, and they are salivating. They are eager to, right? There are predatory investors who want to buy up vacant properties. In some cases, sort of manipulate small homeowners into selling their homes for less than they're worth. They purchase the properties, they'll flip them or really quickly turn them into, they'll demolish the property, right, and then turn it into luxury housing in a place where we need more affordable housing. Anyway, so with legislation like the Small Home Anti-Speculation Act, what we would seek to do is implement essentially a flip tax to try to disincentivize these sort of practices, and then also generate much needed revenue and dedicate it to the development of truly deeply affordable housing. So there are some important policy proposals to try to address this, and in concert with what we can do on the hyperlocal level in our districts.
Absolutely. I think that's an excellent point. It's really, like you said, the combination of the two. There's the hyperlocal fights, but we need the framework of the state laws, to really advance those fights and make sure they're successful too. And I think some of these initiatives, I'm so glad you mentioned good cause eviction. I know you've been a champion of the legislation for so long, and how much that would do to actually actually help our fights a lot on the local, hyperlocal level, right? Like if we actually had a law that we could point to say, tenants cannot be evicted. They have a right to renew a lease unless it's for good cause. And, I think by doing that, you just change the default completely from, the situation that it is now to really protecting tenants in their home and making sure they're not evicted. And I think that would just change the game completely. So you're absolutely right that it requires these laws on the state level and the city level to really help with these local fights as well. I think the last question that we want to ask, and I'm conscious of the time too, and this has been really an awesome discussion, is from Jeremy. Hey, Jeremy, here in Jackson Heights. Jeremy said, thanks so much for this event. Hi, Julia and Shaker, super informative. Question about the city and state's ability to levy emergency taxes on the super wealthy. And tie that to new revenue streams for the unmet existing affordable housing needs. What are the realistic possibilities and limitations, and what would it take legislatively to change the relative lack of movement of such common sense shifting of budgetary priorities supported by a vast majority of New Yorkers? So how can we get this done, which is so common sense for all of us? How can we get this done on the state level?
Yeah, so I guess I'll start, but certainly welcome your take on it too, Shaker. Right now, so again, we'll be back. We'll be reconvening to conference next week, and hopefully, as many of us have been pushing for, actually reconvening in session to vote on various revenue proposals. Some include like the legalization of marijuana. But others that I think are more important for us to consider right now, because they would more quickly generate the revenue that's needed, include an expanded multimillionaires tax, a sort of billionaires tax or a mark-to-market tax, a financial transaction tax. What all of these proposals, and there are many more, by the way, some that I've also introduced, such as an expanded mortgage recording tax. We call it a mezzanine debt tax. A lot of these, what these proposals would do is, first of all, bring economic justice by more equitably taxing our residents of our city and state. New York has more billionaires with a B, in our state than any other state. And they are currently not required to pay their fair share of taxes, right? There's also a proposed pied-à-terre tax, a tax on non-primary residents in New York City. All of these, we desperately need them because the solutions that we know we need for this housing crisis, for this moment, but even beyond this moment, for the many other things that our communities need that we won't get into tonight because we're focused on housing, addressing, trying to eliminate homelessness. It's not a utopian idea. It's something we could do in this city. All of this is going to require revenue on top of needing to address a state budget deficit, right? We really need revenue. The prospects of it, well, right now we know even people who, I'm left wing in the Democratic Conference in the state Senate, but there are people who are not even, they don't even consider themselves left wing. We wouldn't consider them left wing, who completely agree. They know what time it is. This is an economic crisis, and we can't continue to wait for the federal government to step in and save us. And so it really is time for us to tax the rich, to tax the very wealthy in our state. And we're going to be having those conversations in the coming weeks. And I'm really pushing for us to actually act on them before the new legislative session, and not wait until the state budget, which is typically what the governor would want us to do.
I think you put it so well, Julia, that really this is, in Jeremy's question too, these are common sense things that it's all a matter of perspective, right? Like the notion there should be no one in New York State, in the country, that is homeless. And the fact that that is a radical thing for some people to say, or for some people think that it's a radical thing to say, is just beyond me. This is, housing is a human right. That's what that means. And if we think about, like you said, how many billionaires we have in New York taxing the rich, I get these questions sometimes too about, well, how can government really invest in public housing? Where's the money going to come from to build, community land trust, or to design them, or HDFCs, or, a New York Homes Guarantee? And the crazy part about it to me is really, we spend so much money as a government subsidizing private development. We have for decades, whether it's the actual money and dollars that we put into doing it, whether it's 421A tax breaks with no enforcement of them, J51, all these things that we do to incentivize private developers to build and further displace. If you took all of that funding and all of those priorities and actually put it towards, or policing budgets and things like that, and actually put it towards housing and actually addressing homelessness, building truly affordable housing by government, investing in public housing, repairing NYCHA, it is eminently possible. But I think it just requires a complete shifting of framework of looking at it in one lens, the issue, to a completely different one. And, I think you put it so well, how that needs to happen. And it needs to happen now, really, in this moment too. So with that, I want to say thank you so much, Senator Salazar. It is always so nice to talk to you. What an inspired conversation too. I want to thank everyone who's joined as well. This is, as I said before, the first in our series of Shake It Up with Shaker conversations on housing justice. Come join our fight. Visit our website, www.voteshaker.com, SHEKAR. And please stay tuned for the next one. We're so excited to have everyone. I just want to say again, thank you so much, Senator. It's really been so great to talk to you too. So thank you all so much. And Vote Shaker too. Yes, that's right. Thank you, Millie. Take care, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you, Shaker. Thank you, everyone.
Take care.